opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, immediately contesting the center and promising dynamic play. Challenging the center immediately, this bold riposte aims to disrupt white's central pawn and open lines for active piece development. Opening the center creates immediate tension, daring black to recapture or face a space advantage. Developing a knight early to eye the center after recapturing is a standard way to reclaim initiative and prepare for pawn recapture. Disrupting black's pawn structure with a king hunt initiated by the bishop's diagonal threat. Protecting the pawn sacrifice, black develops a piece and prepares to castle, aiming for rapid kingside safety while maintaining central tension. Developing the bishop to c4 targets the weak f7 pawn and prepares for castling, creating active piece play. Unpinning the knight allows development, but a pin on your own bishop creates immediate tactical pressure. Pushing the f-pawn weakens your king's shelter, potentially creating vulnerabilities for later attacks. Unblocking the queen's path, this bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, challenging white's central pawn structure. Pushing the pawn forward so aggressively on g4 immediately creates a spatial advantage on the king side, but it also weakens the pawn structure and potentially exposes the white king to counterplay. Black should carefully consider if they can exploit this newfound vulnerability by developing pieces to pressure those advanced pawns or launch a direct attack. This pawn advance demands vigilance and a sharp eye for tactical opportunities from both sides. Retreating the bishop to c8, a seemingly passive repositioning, paradoxically aims to consolidate a weak queenside and potentially reroute this piece for future defensive or offensive maneuvers, perhaps towards a more active square later on if the g-pawn push is successfully contained. Developing a piece to the center, knight offers a more robust defense of the d-pawn than the previous pawn push, while also preparing to join the queenside expansion. Deploying the knight to d7 solidifies the center and prepares for queenside development, a measured response to white's aggressive kingside pawn push that offers black breathing room to regroup and potentially counterattack down the semi-open d-file. Pushing the pawn aggressively gains significant kingside space, but it also opens a critical diagonal towards your own king and weakens the light squares around it, demanding careful defensive coordination from here on. The knight bravely ventures forward, immediately challenging the bishop and forcing a decision, while simultaneously aiming to disrupt white's burgeoning queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's own pieces. Opening up a diagonal for the bishop, this repositioning aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create opportunities for a knight fork later. Reasserting control of the d7 square with the knight now prevents the immediate threat of a devastating knight fork after a potential pawn push on the king side, while also preparing to redeploy this piece to a more active square on the queen side, perhaps c5, to challenge white's advanced pawn structure. Unleashing a flank pawn storm, white dramatically widens the fight, seeking to break open black's king position and seize initiative. This aggressive pawn push, while creating dynamism, also potentially weakens white's own kingside structure and requires careful follow-up. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately injects new tactical possibilities, but it also relocates the knight to a square where it might become a target for white's advancing kingside pawn storm. Consider how this centralization impacts your control of key central squares and the safety of your own monarch in the ensuing skirmishes. Seizing the central pawn and opening lines for your queen and rook, this capture injects immediate dynamism, forcing black to clarify their knight's ambiguous position and potentially creating weaknesses on the dark squares around their king. Securing a pawn with the knight's support, this move immediately challenges the bishop's presence, aiming to disrupt white's central influence and potentially unpin the pinned knight on d7 for future development. Reclaiming the outpost on c4 aims to re-establish pressure on the queen side and potentially prepare for further pawn advances, but it neglects the open e-file, leaving white's king a tad exposed to potential central breakthroughs by black. Releasing the pawn tension on the queen side opens up lines, but it also grants white's bishop a clear diagonal to retreat and maintain its influence along that crucial square. A bold recapture, sacrificing the bishop's attacking potential for immediate material equality and a streamlined position, though it does invite black's pawn to advance and potentially dominate the center. Unlocking the center with this knight maneuver injects dynamic possibilities, challenging white's pawn structure and threatening to disrupt the harmonious development of white's pieces. A strategic redeployment to solidify the d5 pawn's presence, simultaneously offering a potential retreat to a safer square if the knight on e5 proves too aggressive. Intensifying the pawn storm on the kingside while simultaneously disrupting white's knights creates a complex web of threats and counter-threats, forcing white to carefully consider the safety of their king. Shifting the knight to f3 reinforces the central pawn push and prepares for kingside castling, aiming to secure the monarch behind a now solid structure, while also unpinning the bishop on c4, which was momentarily restricted by the knight on e5. The knight's centralizing push aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay, but it risks overextending and becoming a target for white's knights and bishops before black's own pieces are fully mobilized. Carving open the center with this pawn thrust directly confronts black's knight and prepares to challenge for control of the d-file, potentially creating new avenues for attack while simultaneously defending the bishop on c4. Black consolidates a slightly cramped position, offering a pawn to improve knight placement and aim for a more harmonious development, acknowledging the central pressure white is exerting. Solidifying the central pawn structure, white aims to build a robust foundation for their pieces, potentially preparing to challenge the d-file or expand on the kingside later. Seeking central liberation, black endeavors to activate the queen, eyeing the pawn on d4 as a potential target, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the knight towards more active squares or to contest the open d-file. Unleashing the queen aggressively seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create imbalances, although it leaves the queen somewhat exposed to counterplay on the queen side. Disrupting the anticipated pawn structure on the king side with f6 creates immediate tactical complications, potentially opening lines for black's pieces, while simultaneously exposing the king's defenses to white's aggressive knight and queen positioning. Opening up the kingside rook to g1 aims to intensify pressure along the g-file, potentially preparing a pawn storm or even a direct assault on the black monarch if it remains on its current square. This bold commitment of the rook suggests a desire to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's knight on c6 and its pawn structure, which is a bit compressed after moves like e6. It's a territorial grab that demands a precise response from black, who must consider whether to reinforce the king side or seek counterplay elsewhere to alleviate the growing pressure. Sacrificing the bishop presents a bold, albeit risky, attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it leaves the king exposed to a swift attack on the open diagonals. Finally, white recaptures the bishop, consolidating material equality and beginning to exert pressure on the now exposed black king's defenses. The exchange on f3 simplifies the position, clearing the path for white's pieces to potentially coordinate and exploit the weakened dark squares around the black monarch. Consider how this pawn structure imbalance might play out in the coming exchanges. Does black have sufficient compensation for the compromised kingside? Exposing the monarch to the open c-file after castling queenside signals a willingness to engage in a sharp, aggressive game, prioritizing immediate activity over structural solidity. Securing the central pawn chain and developing an immediate attacking pressure on the queenside, this maneuver forces black to confront the exposed kingside structure and consider a delicate defensive dance. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, especially with the open files and distant threats on the queenside. The knight's relocation, though seemingly passive, subtly bolsters the pawn shield and prepares for eventual kingside action, potentially igniting a crucial fight for central dominance. Opening up a new avenue for your queen while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure. This maneuver subtly aims to disrupt black's king's safety by preparing for future pawn pushes and potential piece exchanges on your terms. Opening up a diagonal for the queen to potentially support the kingside pawn storm is a strategic gambit that might offer some queenside counterplay, though it leaves the bishop somewhat passive on its current square, awaiting further development to become truly active. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to puncture black's pawn shield, the intention is to tear open lines for your attacking pieces and potentially expose the black king once it castles. This gambit aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed defense and introduce immediate tactical complications. A critical decision is made to reopen lines for counterplay, accepting a compromised pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop here is a bold gamble, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure around the king by eliminating one of the defenders on the c-file and opening a path for your own pieces. You're creating immediate structural weaknesses that could pay dividends later, forcing black to choose between a potentially compromised pawn chain or further positional concessions. This exchange fundamentally alters the landscape, potentially paving the way for more aggressive central play or attacks along the newly opened lines. Doubling pawns on the c-file, an unavoidable consequence, now presents black with the immediate challenge of defending against potential pressure down that open line. However, the silver lining is the creation of a strong central pawn majority and a slightly more active bishop, potentially leading to counterplay if white isn't careful with their pawn advances. Opening the f-file now offers immediate attacking potential against the enemy king, which is critically exposed on the queen side. Alternatively, it prepares to reposition pieces more actively. A bold gambit, black throws open the e-file, aiming to shatter white's pawn structure and create immediate complications around the king. This aggressive action seeks to exploit the slightly exposed nature of white's monarch, forcing immediate defensive considerations and potentially disrupting white's coordinating pieces. The intention is to generate active counterplay rather than passively defend, a necessary strategy given white's central pawn presence and development. Unleashing the open f-file offers a direct assault on the uncastled king's lingering safety, creating immediate attacking potential. A bold counter to the pawn push, immediately contesting the center and opening new avenues for the rook. Securing the castled king by whisking it away to the safety of the queen side begins a new phase, aiming to centralize forces and open lines, a bold gambit given the exposed pawn structure on the king side, suggesting white anticipates black's potential counterplay with the opened e-file. Suddenly, the closed center explodes, opening vital avenues for black's rook to seize the f-file, aiming to disrupt white's uncastled king. Unlocking the f-file for the rook immediately amplifies its attacking potential, directly challenging black's defensive structure and promising a sharp, dynamic continuation. The doubled rooks on the f-file now confront each other, setting the stage for a decisive exchange that will fundamentally alter the complexion of the board. Unlocking the d-file after the rook exchange transforms white's potential for a swift assault, turning a static position into a dynamic battleground where the king's safety becomes paramount. Reclaiming that pawn opens a vital diagonal for your queen, aiming directly at white's exposed king and offering immediate counterplay where none seemed apparent moments ago. Exploiting the exposed monarch, the queen's descent forces a difficult decision regarding the king's safety, threatening a swift checkmate or significant material loss.